So we're trying to make sure I'm on.
You're wrong.
I'm on, okay.
Obviously, look at the green, my God.
Two things. Number one, I sometimes I post things on Facebook and I put nice spiritual things and I get about 100 people. I put something on about the Eagles and I get over 300.
Pros and cons.
Somebody made this for me.
Oh,
Hey,
oh, yeah.
Can you wear it?
I got a lot of posts saying, "Oh, Father, you would definitely not take that to a liturgical thing," but I love it. So, some of you may have saw my post, some of you haven't, but someone not in this room, but a good friend, is taking me to the NFC Championship game.
Plenary indulgence.
I told him I would think about it.
For about 2 seconds.
Yes. I called one oblate and said, "I absolutely need you here to cover my masses because we have to leave at 9 a.m. They said the game doesn't start till 3.
Early, often.
We're leaving at 9 a.m. and somebody's covering mass for me.
You gotta get early.
So put that aside. I would like to tackle this evening a lot of time in terms of the what we're going to look at, the historical books. So, yes, now this is what we have been looking at in terms of the whole series. But this evening, I'm going to focus on this section and these books. And essentially what I'm going to do is look at the history of Israel in those books. And there's a lot of stuff in there. But hopefully what I review this evening will remind all of us that as Catholics and Christians, we should know this history. And so there will be some things that you will say, "Oh yes, that's very familiar." And other things you're like, "Oh, I didn't know that was in there." So hopefully we'll learn some things. And what I would like to do in trying to look at the historical books is to look at these 5 major periods. And they begin with the death of Moses, which happens at the end of Deuteronomy. And it begins with the book of Joshua, which is where we're going to begin. And it goes through the monarchy, the division, the exiles, and then the return. And it takes us all the way up to about 160 BC. So we're going to cover a lot of ground. And I'm not going to say everything about everything, but I have 35 slides, so I have a lot to say. Some of it is, I just put stories up there that we really know, and so we can review them. So let's take each one and walk through it. So Moses dies. He passes things on to Joshua. And so the book of Joshua talks about the people crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land, settling in. And most of the book is about that. And then once they get settled, we go into the next part, which is the book of Judges. So this first section covers 2 of the 12 books that we're going to look at. Let me just go back here. This is a good summary of everything. The people were faithful, God was with them. And then they got lazy, and God challenged them. Then they got faithful, and God helped them. And it continued that process. Even to today. With even looking at, the news today about what's going on in Israel, continuing to have that, things run smoothly, then they go to hell, and then they come back again, literally. The book's primary figure is Joshua, which means Yahweh saves. It's an appropriate name for the man who will lead Israel under God's command. And they're going to have all these conquests to kind of get themselves settled in the land. when you read Joshua, you're going to get a sense that, and this is a great timeline of everything, this is all the chapters. And it's simply broken down into these first 12 chapters where they're settling in and making conquest. And then they start to try to figure things out in terms of the tribes. Takes about 25 years. This, if you really, that's why I put the slides so that if you get them, you can study it. If you follow this, and I'm just going to kind of point, so they're in this land over here, right? Across the Jordan. And then they start making their way, conquering things. They go this way, and they go up here. And they're taking over and getting settled in the land. And all these things are different battles with the different people in the different parts. And they get settled. And then they're going to begin to have them taken over by the different 12 tribes and get themselves settled. These are some of the major ones that we remember when they take over Jericho. We heard stories about Gideon, the battle against the north, and then they're getting their presence up here. All of these is that they simply are trying to get their way into the land. Why is Joshua important? Because it appears in the reading that it is quick and swift. And they get into the land, and God helps them, and they make great progress. But at the end of the day, they only are taking over about 25% of the land, right? They didn't finish getting the conquest done as they needed to do, but they made progress getting it some done. What they want to show in the whole story of the book of Joshua is that this small group of Hebrew people, Israelites, would not be able to do it without God's help. So that's the story. They couldn't battle the enemies if God wasn't helping them, right? And as long as they were doing what they're supposed to do, things work out. As soon as they falter, enemies come in and take over. And that's the story as you read the book of Joshua. Many, many different battles. I don't know if we can, spend time trying to name all of them, but the idea is they have these battles, they succeed where they pay attention to God, and where they don't succeed. And eventually have to keep going back to get it right. These are the contradictions. Where there's faithfulness, like the Battle of Jericho, Caleb, Rahab, things work well. But then, the failure of some of the tribes to annihilate God's enemy, Joshua making a treaty with the Gibeonites, that first seeking the Lord, and then the sins of the people. So what happens is when they follow God, it works. And that's what you see in these stories. And when they don't, it doesn't happen. And what the big thing that Joshua doesn't do is they don't completely take care of the people in the land. They make bargains with them. And the bargains always are going to go a little bit contrary to the covenant. And it's going to come back and bite them eventually. All right? Because they don't complete it and they're not faithful. When they're faithful, they succeed. When they're not, they run into trouble. And if you can keep that in mind, that just happens over and over again in the stories. As they make their way, taking over the land that is called the Promised Land. The point that Joshua and the author wants to make in this is that although they made it look like it was easy and decisive and they got their way into the land, it wasn't. But the point they want to make is that Israel was not fighting on its own. It was God who gave them help and strength with a small band of tribes to overcome powerful enemies. They can't do it without God's help. And God fulfills his promise and helps them. And that story is told over and over again throughout the book of Joshua as they make their way into the Promised Land. All right? So now they're in the Promised Land and they're getting settled. that leads us to the next phase of their history. Lots of little stories around getting settled, but now that they are in the land, and they're going to continue to make conquers, and they're going to continue to have trouble. And the book of Judges outlines that. This period of Judges, and the book of Judges, covers about 200 years. In those days, Israel didn't have kings. They were 12 tribes, and the 12 tribes were following the 12 sons of Jacob. Each had a city gate and a wise person, and the judge for each of them was someone that God sent when they needed help. In fact, the best definition of a judge, and I'll go back, is they were warlords, renowned for their brave behavior in winning battles. They rose in time of need, they led tribes to victory, and they were each chosen by God. Not kings, but they were called judges, and these individuals were the ones that helped them when there was a need. So when things were going well, they didn't need it. When things were problematic, when they needed to conquer a piece of land, then the judges were there to help them take care of their enemies. I'm going to go back. This is the cycle of Judges, and it's just the cycle of the Jewish people. All right? Israel serves the Lord. Israel falls into sin and idolatry. They're enslaved, or they're taken over by an enemy. Israel cries out to God. God raises a judge. The judge delivers them, and then Israel serves the Lord.
Pattern.
Over and over and over again with all the different stories. Each one of the judges, the same story over and over again. Yes?
Would the judges then be considered prophets?
So the judges were not considered prophets, although they were chosen by God. The judges were to bring the people in a time of need to a place where they needed to be. So they sometimes settled disputes. So there was some of that kind of legal stuff going on among the tribes. But their primary thing was that they came up, they were risen by God to help the people in various times, in times of need. Right? To get back on track. Because they had stopped and they cried out and God answered them with the judge. Right? There are 12 judges, so I want to look at them. All right? Most of them, half of them, I would say 6 of them, are mentioned in a few verses. They literally would say, for example, these two here, 16 verses for the 2 judges. They came, they did their stuff, and everything was good, basically, and they're conquering, right? The ones that I put bolded are probably the most ones we would know. Gideon, we hear that name in Scripture. We all know the story of Samson, right? He was one of the judges. Othniel and Ulyet are the first ones. And we remember the story of Deborah. She was a favorite. She was the only woman. This one here was called, but he usurped and he became a tyrant. So they don't consider him a judge. Anybody think they can pronounce that name? Want to say it? Abimelech? That's it, that's not bad. Of course, it's Othniel,
I think worse.
Ehud, Shamgar, Barak, Deborah, Gideon, Toler and Jar, Zephaniah, or Jephthah. Now these 3, they only have 7 verses to all of them. Elon, Abnon, Abazan, and then Samson.
There's more than 12 of them.
What was the time for that whole circle to occur in most cases? Do you know?
No, because we only have the verses. We do have the period of, this is over a course of 200 years.
All of those within 200 years?
Yes.
Gotcha.
So there's a 200-year history. And of course, in this period of their history, it's about, and it's all involved in the settlement in the Promised Land, of taking care of the various enemies that still, again, they didn't finish it in Joshua, so now they have to deal with the little bits of it. And whenever they feel like they're going to be overcome, they cry out to God, God sends them a judge, and they get out of it. So as you read all these stories, you can read one of them, and I read this, it's not that many pages, one night, and it's like, oh my God, so it's the same thing over and over again. It's just different names, but the circumstances don't change. And it's fascinating. And of course, the point that the author wants to make in the book of Judges is that, and it goes back to that cyclical thing, when things are going well, great, but when they start going, or the enemy starts coming in because they haven't been faithful, and the story is, when you're not faithful, the enemy is taken over. And you're going to be enslaved in some way. You're going to be taken over by the enemy. So that's when they cry out to God for help. God sends them a judge, and when they're delivered, they go back to being faithful, and then it doesn't take long, and they go back into the same behavior. Anything different in the 21st century?
No, it's all the same.
And this could describe any one of our lives at different times. Just keep going into that circle. And of course, the point is that God always is there. Israel always comes back, all right? And God and together make it work, all right? Yes.
When I think of Gideon, I think about Gideon's Bible.
Yeah, that's what I think of, yeah.
Now, what is that? What's the connection?
Probably connected to him, but I don't want to get too distracted on that tonight,
I'm sorry.
because that'll take us off to another tangent. All right.
Father,
Yes.
Are these judges, or you probably gonna mention, are they like soldiers?
Yes, that's the point here. They were, the best word that is, they're leaders, but warlords. In other words, they came and helped them organize so that they could defeat the enemy, and then once again, they would be safe, right? In the land. All this is about living in the land of,
Well, the judge stays there or he leaves?
well, he moves on.
He moves on,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you can see some of the big ones. This is where they're coming in and taking over at different sections. For example, Jericho. This one's moving across Manasseh. This one is, if I say these names, I'm just going to butcher them. Deborah's going into Hareseth. This one is going into Asher. Samson is going down in here into Gath. And so that's how they enter into the Promised Land and get things settled, where there's trouble with the enemies. So eventually they're all there and settled.
So they're going in because there's existing trouble, they're
No, this is their Promised Land.
Yeah.
So they're going in, but there's obviously people occupying it, and that's the enemy. But the Lord promises them, this is the Promised Land, and so they're going in and taking over.
Where
Now,
were they before?
they're already there, but they're now beginning to occupy it better. But these are the different places where these had to fight for them, where the enemy started to rise up. And of course, they make deals, and some of the deals were not so good, and then they came back to get them after a period of time. Same story over and over again. It's just different names for the different judges who are risen. Again, these are the main ones, right? Because they were bigger battles. But each of these stories is foretold in the book of Judges. So this period of God calling forth judges, not prophets. Judges is a leader who helps them get through whatever trouble there is as they complain to the Lord. They get it right, they get it wrong. Yes?
You have 12 judges. Did each judge come from a different tribe?
No, there just happen to be 12 that are men. And again, remember, half of them, all we know is their name. Because there's only a few verses about them in the Bible, saying that they came on the scene, they did this battle, and everything was good. Right? But these are the big ones in terms of remembrance.
So who's fighting with the Israelites? I mean, is it?
So,
who was there first? It wasn't the Israelites.
no. So the people who were in the land And most of them were chased out, but some of them stayed, and that's what they're trying to clean up, to take over. So you would also see, I don't know if you can see back there, but you have names like Dan, Naphtali, Zebulun, Ephraim, Dan, Judah. These are the Reuben, these are the 12 tribes, and this is where they're settling to take over. And that's where that tribe is, all right, as they get settled. And so obviously, EHUD, he is helping basically the tribe of Benjamin that's having a little bit of trouble around Jericho getting settled in, and have some enemies there they have to kind of get under control, if you will, right? And that's what all these names are in these stories, and so, you know, it's hard for us to remember them all, but if you want to just get the overall history of it, it's about these continuing to settle in, and there are pockets of enemies that need to still be sorted out, and the judges help them do that, right? And of course, the reason why they're not getting it right is because they're sinning. That's the connection that they keep going back and forth with. And when they're faithful, things go well.
So when we're talking about like they're having these battles, were they actual physical
Yep,
battles,
yep,
or were
yep.
they like
Yes.
let's?
Yep, because they're trying to get the enemy so that they can have that territory in peace, where they can take control of it. Right? So this is the kingdom of Israel eventually. It's not all united yet. Right now it's just individual tribes trying to make it work. And where they need trouble, God brings forth a judge to help them get more settled into the land. It's all about the land, this first phase of getting the conquest under control and settling in. But there's a correlation between when they get lost in their own idolatry and sinfulness. In other words, they start marrying into the enemy, some of that too. So, a little bit more about the 12 tribes, all right? So, not to try to get us too bogged down, but Jacob, all right, he had 4, I don't know, what do you want to call them?
No, 2 wives and 2 mistresses.
Yeah, so with all them, thank you, the end result was there were 12 children, all right? All the blue are the 12 children, and they are the 12 tribes, all right? And then, of course, their children have children, like Saul comes from the tribe of Benjamin, King David comes from the tribe of Judah, Moses and Aaron come out of this. You know, you can see what's happening here. The history. Right? Levites, priests, high priests are all coming out of this. Right? It's I thought it was a good picture to give you a sense of, that's where the 12 tribes come from. Right? And the 12 children of Jacob. Right? That's
That's good, that's good portrayal.
Apparently, there's one girl
Oh, it's a girl?
came from this, but she doesn't get a tribe, of course. That would have happened.
Of course it's not.
It's a girl.
That's what
No
went,
offense there.
that's what went wrong.
Let's just keep moving on.
Don't start trouble. Those are the troublemakers, right here. Okay.
So now there's this book of Ruth that's at the end of Judges' time, written around the 6th to 4th century BC, during the time of the Judges, about a woman from Moab who remains faithful to her Israelite mother-in-law after the death of their husbands. She accepts Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, as her God, and accepts the Israelite people as her own. All right? One of the wonderful things that she says that's memorable in the book is this quote to Naomi. She says, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me."
Wow.
Now, we sing this, there's a song.
Yes.
Wherever you go, right?
Yeah.
You didn't have to sing the whole thing.
I don't know what the song is. What's that?
Never mind.
Moms and fathers.
He's criticizing my voice. It's a very short book. It's very, very quick reading. It's a great little story. So that one you could read before you go to bed. You know, the Book of Ruth. Yes.
I think it's Carol King.
The author?
The singer.
The singer. So that's right. So it's a great quote from the book there. So it's only because it's during the time of that. So now we move from the first piece, conquering the land and settling the land and getting rid of all these different issues. And what happens with Joshua and all these is the judges is trying to get it right. All right. Now they need to move into a whole new segment, and now is the work toward. That's why it says the move from tribal to monarchy. And so during these days we have the arrival of Samuel, and he anoints 3 kings, and it's Saul and David that are anointed in his life, and David anoints his son Solomon. We're going to review all of these kings and what happens in terms of their major accomplishments in the history of Israel. Right? Everybody with me so far?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not making it too complex?
No.
It's a lot of stuff.
So the judges took me 4 hours to do today, just doing the judges. I mean the kings. I did the judges yesterday, so that's why I was getting frustrated, because I spent my whole day off doing this, and I'm like, I'm showing this PowerPoint. So Samuel was a judge. He's considered the last of the judges. He is a priest, and he's a prophet. Samuel, his name means heard of God. He was dedicated to God by his mother Hannah. We might remember that story. As part of a vow she made before God, he was born. Hannah was barren and prayed fervently for a child. God granted her requests, and true to her promise, Hannah dedicated Samuel to the Lord. After Samuel was weaned, likely around the age of 4, he was brought to the temple to serve under Eli the priest. Now we all know this famous story, right? So this is the call of Samuel.
Mm-hmm.
So he is a boy, maybe 10 to 12 years old. He is sleeping, and he wakes up. He has this voice that he keeps saying, Samuel, Samuel. Remember, and then Eli realizes what's happening, and then tells him to make that wonderful statement. When the Lord speaks to him again, he says, "Speak, for your servant is listening." We hear that's a very famous scripture passage, so I thought I would put it there. So Samuel comes along, and Eli helps him out. And Samuel, as he gets into his ministry, is asked by God, because Israel wants a king. Now that they're getting taken over the country, they're doing better, there's less conquest. And so there's this, the Ammonite army is still out there, but Saul, they give it to him. So the Lord picks Saul to be the first king. I think this is a movie. That's where I got that from. Because it doesn't look like the old other pictures. Yes.
Pretty strong guy.
Father, wasn't God angry that they wanted to go to monarchy?
Yes, and actually even Samuel was not for it. But the people wanted it. And the Lord warned them, if we go this route, there are going to be some entrapments, and you're going to fall prey to them. And what happens?
They do.
They do. All right. They fall for, and basically they make compromises. They begin to engage in behavior that is sinful, and we have all kinds of stories of idolatry and murder going on as they try to manipulate things, and it all keeps coming back to them if they don't stay on track. So some things about the first king. Around 1043 BC is when he's made king. Saul turns out to be pretty good. He wins some battles against the Philistines, but even at this point, they never complete all the battles that need to be done to unite Israel, because there's still other people in the land. One of Saul's downfalls is he's moody, rash, unorganized, and turns Samuel against him, and Samuel gets mad at him because of his arrogance. Now, we don't know anybody like that, do we? In fact, he has a dispute with his son Jonathan, who hooks up with David, and not in a...
That's why
Rosa! They join forces. Okay.
Did you say?
He's a young aide to Saul, but when he kills the Philistine hero Goliath, remember the story?
Right.
That's a great. David's popularity and great warrior skills provokes rage in Saul, and then it is all downhill. Saul and Jonathan, though, in one of these battles, are killed on Mount Gilboa, and then David is then anointed king. So, great guy, starts out great, does a lot of work to get some of this work done in terms of the battles, but eventually his personal stuff gets in the way. Sound like anybody we know in history?
Oh, no.
All right. David's rise to power, did I put down?
No, you forgot.
So the book of Samuel, the first book, has all this in it. So that's all that wears. And whereas the second book of Samuel has all the story of... So the first book is about Samuel and Saul, and then book 2 of Samuel is about David and his rise to power. David is born in Judah, which is one of the tribes, in Bethlehem in 1035, just around the time that Saul is king. He's the youngest son of Jesse. He reigns over the tribe of Judah for about 8 years, and then he reigns over Israel. And he reigns over Israel once Saul is dead. Spends most of his life as a shepherd. So some of the things in the book, we find the story about him being anointed king of Judah first, all right, of the one tribe. And Judah, which we'll begin to see, is going to be the southern part, all right, and then the north. David finally reigns over all of it, Israel and Judah, gets it all united. He is equipped with that gift of bringing and this is where the whole Israel is now under one unity. It took some time to get there, and David does a great deal of work to do that. He then begins the plans to build the temple, that magnificent temple that he built. The Philistines, Moab, and Syrians are defeated by David and his army. That continues. So he completely, all the enemies are gone now. And he begins to bring some unity. In the process, his son Amnon forced himself on his half-sister, Tamar, and he's killed by Tamar's brother, Absalom. All right, so there we have family intrigue. And then David's son Absalom conspires against his father, and then he's killed in battle. So, not only, it just goes on and on. And then all these stories about the intrigue of David's time. The Philistines engage in battle against David, who was nearly killed by 4 of them, and they're considered the 4 brothers of Goliath. That story is told. David, his son Solomon, and his son, and David gives I messed this up a little bit. David gives his son Solomon and his sons the responsibility of building God's temple. Right? He had the plans, and now he gives them the responsibilities in 1 Chronicles, and the plans are ready to go to build it. David has Solomon crowned as king, so when he dies, Solomon succeeds. David does die. Solomon becomes king of Israel, the third king. This here is the tombstone of King David. It is in the, you can visit it in Rome. It's right in the vicinity, walking distance of where Jesus with Calvary was and where the church for the resurrection is. So it's all right outside there, and you can go into this building, and it doesn't look like this today. This was a picture taken a while ago. It's split in half, so there's a wall between it. So in tradition, men have to go on one side and women on the other. They can't go on the same side. I don't know why that, but it's very much the same thing. If you go to the Temple Mount wall, you know, there's a wall there that says men on one side and women on the other.
I have a question.
Yes.
If Solomon had power united both Judah and Israel, right?
David did.
Oh, excuse me, okay, you said David.
David was considered the.
Wouldn't Solomon have both kingdoms? You're saying king
Yes,
of Israel?
Solomon did too.
Okay.
But I'm not there yet, so don't
I'm
jump
sorry.
ahead. But it's good because I don't want you to get confused. So David's one that unites them all.
Right.
David has a lot of behavior, like he takes on, he has. I'm surprised I didn't where I put his whole story about him and Bathsheba. You know.
Oh yeah, he's got charisma.
Yes, they all like their women.
Oh,
So David has these children, Absalom and Amnon, and then he has Solomon. Solomon is the result of being in cahoots with Uriah's wife,
Oh yeah.
right? Remember that story? And then Uriah's wife, and then he has Uriah killed,
Right.
and then he has Solomon by Bathsheba, and Solomon then is in the line for the next king. David was, as Israel would look, as one of the greatest kings, but he also had his behavior just like his father in terms of his extramarital stuff, right? And like his son. And yes,
So, I'm not sure if this is true, but I've read that King David, had written most of the Psalms that are there. Is that true?
that is correct.
And
So-
it's very bright.
In fact,
Bright.
yes, and the same will be said of his son. Very bright. It was a bright spot, but one of the things that David was always forgiven is that when his sin or his behavior was brought to the forefront by the prophets, for example, the prophet Nathan, David listened. And David was exuberant about his getting back to the Lord. So although he went off track, when it was brought to his attention and he was remorseful, he was all about serving Yahweh. So that piece gets him the part that he was good at. David would be considered the one that unified the 12 tribes. All right. His son is going to do other things, but David is the one that brought it together and got the 12 tribes united. All right. Only to have his son, this picture is a work from the 19th century about King Solomon writing the Proverbs. So whereas David wrote most of the Psalms, we have much of the book of Proverbs being written by Solomon, the book of Solomon written by Solomon, and a good portion of the book of Ecclesiastes. Those songs were attributed to Solomon. He's the son of David and Bathsheba, as I said. His name means peaceable. His reign as third king was from these years, in 970 to 931, about 40 years. They were peace and stability under Solomon. And Solomon had some of his challenges. His half-brother, Adonijah, had to be killed to secure the kingship because he wanted to take over. So everybody's killing somebody.
Survival of the fittest.
One of the major accomplishments of Solomon is the temple. And now, you know, the temple's up here, but all the stuff that he built to that and the wall around the city, you know, which you can still see pieces of it today, that was built. Interesting understanding of Solomon, it took them 7 years to build this.
That's pretty good.
But it took 13 years to build Solomon's palace. Solomon was devoted to the Lord, but Solomon also took care of Solomon. And we'll see some of that in terms of his life. He's the one that dedicated the temple to God and brought the Ark of the Covenant to the temple, because he built it. David unified. Solomon, this is his primary, but he did many other things in terms of accomplishments. I list a whole bunch of things he did. He was a political organizer. So Israel was organized into a state with 12 districts. And who do you think those 12 districts followed? Yeah, they all had a part. They all had a say, and they were all considered equal. He made Israel rich by trading with other countries. These are very quick overviews of things he did. He was a diplomatic ruler, established great friendly ties with his neighbors. He was very diplomatic to get things done. He was a builder, his palace, government buildings, all that. He was a man of wisdom, and he really listened to the Lord and was able to make a lot of good happen during his leadership. So he wrote the Proverbs and some of the other books that we talked about. Not a bad accomplishment, but Solomon had his weakness. He married many. In some cases, it said 300 different people.
Really, you gotta be kidding.
I don't know how you have sex with that many people. I don't know if it's just an exaggeration.
It'll take 40 years for him to take her.
Yes. But, and many different nations, so he was very open-minded.
I'll say.
Or the women.
He lived extravagantly at the expense of the people, because the people had to pay for it with high taxes. To get that work done, there was forced labor. So the very thing that they got away from in terms of Egypt, they were now being imposed
Again.
back in their own promised land. He made deals with the people around him, that's how he kept the peace. But a lot of idols, a lot of idol worship around the temple that he built. He sold Israelite territory to King Tyre, which wasn't helpful. He made treaties with other nations when he was told not to do that. All these things and others made Solomon start to break away from the Torah. And as a result of these marriages and worship and all these other things, began to break from Yahweh, and that was the beginning, although the division of the two parts of Israel didn't happen under Solomon. At his death, that did. It set into motion the downfall of really Israel. And it started with a divided kingdom. So his two sons got different parts. Rehoboam was the next king when his father Solomon died. He became king, gathered people together. The elders of the court advised him that if he did this, that is, get the people to work harder. So the people were working hard as slaves already, and they were recommended to him. One said, make it easier on the people, and others advising, make it harder. And when he chose to make it harder, that was the beginning of the downfall, because the people began to resist it. He ignored that advice, and that began to move the kingdom into two parts. The north and the south broke. Rehoboam, who was king of the smaller part, was called Judah, and Jeroboam, the other brother, became king of the larger part, called Israel. Now let's take those two parts a little bit. I'm going to try to, because this is an interesting segment of the history. So 10 of the tribes were in the orange area, and 2 of the tribes down here. All right? This was called Israel. This was called Judah. All right? And 2 of the brothers, but the sons of Solomon each had a segment of it. All right? This part, the northern part, that was called Israel, had all of the resources. And so it was easier in the land to produce things. Judah had less access to things, so cultivating food and development was harder on the people. But the one thing that they did have in Judah was that they had the temple and the Jerusalem. And that kept the southern part more intact. And it's going to have an effect on the outcome at the end of this process. It took a few years after the death of Solomon for the Jewish kingdom to divide. The 10 north tribes made their own government and were called Israel, with Samaria as the capital. And the southern, they had the capital was Jerusalem, was called Judea. And that process of division lasted for 160 years. And because of how they chose to live, the northern kingdom began to break away from the covenant pretty extensively, more so than the south. And so they followed idols. They never had, in that 200-year period, a good king. Every single king, I'd say they had 19 kings. During Israel's 209 years, there were 9 dynasties, 19 kings, and not one of them were dedicated to the Lord. Wow. So they were all after whatever they could to get rich and all that. So the northern part lost their way significantly. And because they lost their way significantly, and they weren't listening to the prophets, and that was what Father Michael was trying to explain last week, all these different prophets were in the northern part trying to warn them to change their ways. And there were some successes, and there were not. But ultimately, because they were so focused on their enjoying the idols and just doing what they shouldn't have been doing, they fell into the Assyrians, and there was no return. That captivity was permanent, and most of the Israelis in the northern kingdom were shipped out, and few may have migrated back to Judah, but not many. But the 10 tribes are gone, completely lost, and they never do come back after their captivity. And it's important to remember, because we always think that there's just one Babylonian exile, but there are really 2 exiles, one for the north and one for the south, and we want to look at them for a minute. The southern part, called Judah, with the temple, with Rehoboam, each claimed to be God's chosen king. The southern was known as Judah, lasted more than a century. They lasted longer after the fall. And I think they stayed a little bit more faithful. The promises of the Messiah came out of this area. And when they were conquered by the Babylonians, when they fell, theirs was only for 70 years. They eventually got back into the homeland. During the decline of the southern kingdom, you had the prophets Isaiah, Micah, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, and Habakkuk. They were all trying to get them to get back on track where they had lost. But the story is that the southern didn't stray as severely as the north did. And the Assyrians really wiped out the north. The Babylonians eventually let them go back. And that's the big difference between the two around that. Questions about that much? All right. I just want to take a moment to look at the two exiles because not everybody understands. In fact, I always thought there was just even my own remembrance, the one. I've forgotten about all this Assyrian. This is an ancient picture that was done on a wall describing the captivity of Israel, the northern part, and it's a wonderful piece of artwork. That's the brightest I could get it, but it's all in stone, and it's all the people walking along as they're being taken out of the city. But it's very interesting. Let's see, the Assyrians, this is just the name of the kings that took place. Took about 10 years for the Assyrians to wipe out the Israel in the northern kingdom. And like I said, once that was happened, there was no going back. They all were moved on. They are considered the lost tribes of Israel. You might hear that phrase.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Father, I'm sorry, if you could, like at the top where it says the Assyrian captivity.
Yes.
So those were the 10 tribes that are considered the lost tribes then?
Yes.
So it says there modern Syria and Iraq. So
That's the area that would be today.
today, so there are like descendants of those 10 tribes probably still living in those areas?
Probably not. Well, they were moved. So Syria took over the northern kingdom, and they would be yes. I was thinking they're not in Palestine anymore, but they are. Some of them could be in like Syria and Iraq. There could be some descendants there. Yes. We just don't know what happened to them all. But they did take them out, and in order to make sure that they were not going to rebuild the kingdom, they moved them. And that's so the exile of the northern kingdom was complete and final. And as looking at the history, they do believe some kind of migrated somewhere, but none were left in Israel. They were completely moved out. And so this leaves you with the time of Christ. These would have all been Gentiles. The Babylonian captivity was only a period of 10 years, as I said. Many of the people did go back. Some chose not to go back. And they were considered some individuals who lived in what was called the diaspora, right? We hear that word. Does anybody know what it means? Well, it's there if you don't. So after the Babylonian captivity, they were taken out into Babylon, and some of them chose to stay in Babylon, and yet they were faithful Jews. So they're called the diaspora because they lived among the Gentiles after the Babylonian exile. So when they were free to go back, some chose not to go back, but continued to live there, and they were considered the Jews who were the diaspora. They were Jews, but they lived outside of Palestine. Interesting.
Palestine is located where?
What's that?
Palestine is where?
So that's all of the Holy Land.
Us, Judah.
Yes, Judah.
Didn't that term mean like they were really sad that they couldn't go back or something like that?
No,
They
because,
wanted to live their lives, but they couldn't go back.
right, but they chose not to go back because maybe they were financially secure. They were living in peace. You know, they were not forced into labor, so they just didn't want to uproot their families. Those individuals chose to stay. All right, but they were faithful to Yahweh. They just chose not to go back. Then around, so the Babylonian captivity is the one that ended because the Syrian one didn't end, it just was over. This one ended around 538, and this period of returning to Judah is in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and they tell the story of what they did when they went back. So the book of Ezra mostly has the whole story. And it begins with Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire. After conquering, he freed the Jews to return to their homeland. So he did that around 538. The first ones to go back were Zerubbabel. You may have heard that name, remember that name coming up. They returned first, and others returned later. But those who returned under him, 70 years since they were left, the temple was destroyed. His goal was to bring the people back with him and to rebuild the temple. Right? So their work was rebuilding the temple and trying to get it back to what it was. Ezra came back a little bit later. He was a scribe and priest. The book of Ezra describes the details of him coming back, and now his job was trying to get the people to live their lives the way they were supposed to with the Ten Commandments and the covenant. So his goal was trying to get God's word to the people of Israel and get them to living correctly, learning from the mistake that they made. I was trying to think if there was one other thing that I did not say. I'm just looking. So Daniel, for example, was one who chose to stay in Babylon and became part of the diaspora. Getting the temple built was quite a chore, but they were able to do that within a reasonable amount of time. And they didn't do the slave work as they did before. The last book in this section of historical books is a very short story called the Book of Esther, and it's about this Esther, a Jewish girl who is living in exile, chose to marry this king. He asked her to be his wife, and she used her position to save the Jews and to make life better for Jews who were living in what was called the diaspora. Right? And it's a beautiful little story of how she used her time to make that work. And so it was just kind of like, it kind of ends the story of, here's an example of one of the Jews who decided to live in the diaspora, but used her position to make life better for the Jewish people outside of Palestine.
And isn't Esther part of the Hanukkah story?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. Yes, there's a lot of history. Questions, comments? So my thinking is that I would encourage you to get these slides, because I wrote them so that you didn't need a lot of explanation. There are lots there. And they're just like templates, so that when you choose to read, for example, the book of Esther, put this in front of you. And then you'll get a good sense of, all right, now you understand the context. They're back. Some of the people went back, and here's the story about this young girl and how she was able to be faithful to Yahweh this way. And as you read the story of the judges, you'll get a better sense of what their purpose was. They were not prophets. Now, what you would have gotten next week is a specific, which is not going to happen because we did it last week, is how the different prophets were fit into these areas. And the prophets came when the kingdoms started to divide. That's when they started going off on array. And the prophets were reminding them to change their behavior or it's going to fall apart. Well, eventually it fell apart. The kingdoms were divided, they fell into exile, and the prophets did the best they could to bring the people back. Some were successful, others weren't, but eventually it all comes to play, because the next thing after this is going to be the New Testament soon. What I would like to do next week is take those books that are considered part of the apocryphal books and just not go into all the history of them, but to spend some time understanding why they were chosen to be in the canonical books and why they weren't for others, and look at that history. So won't be as fascinating, but at least give us a reason. And someone would say to you, how come there are these books not included in the Catholic Bible? And you'll be able to walk away, my hope, is with a elevator speech to be able to give them. That is, does everybody know what an elevator speech is? Right? You got 2 minutes to tell your story.
Right.
Right.
So will these slides be on the website with the video
Yes,
presentation?
I'll put both up, just like, did we put the slides up for the first one?
Yes, sir.
So the first presentation has the slides, the second one, the video, the third one, the video. You can shut that off now. Thank you.